and the reason that it's different is because I'm doing a discussion video on one book, which I do periodically, but the book in this case is a volume of poetry, and it's Ariel by Sylvia Plath. And I'm certain that a lot of you know of Ariel if you haven't read it, and I'm certain that most people who will come by this video have heard of Sylvia Plath if you haven't read some of her work. And the reason that it's different for me is because I don't usually review volumes of poetry in this way, and there's what I think is a very good reason for that, and I want to talk a little bit about why that is, because I think some of you might find it interesting, because it has to do with how I read poetry and so on. But I do want to recommend this book, because it's one of the greatest volumes of poetry ever published. Sylvia Plath is one of my favorite poets. To start with why I don't usually review books, volumes of poetry like this, it's because I find talking about poetry in general very difficult. Lyric poetry, not so much epic poetry, because with epic poetry, it's a bit more like reading fiction because there's a story and so on. But I find discussing lyric poetry intelligently extremely difficult. And the reason is because to talk about lyric poetry intelligently requires a lot of cognitive effort. It requires you to sort of really dive deeply into a poem and look at the verses and the images and the turns of phrases and see what this poet is really doing. And that requires a lot of knowledge of the forms of poetry, a lot of knowledge of the techniques of poetry, and a lot of knowledge of poetry in general, poetry that's been written, that I don't necessarily feel like I have. On top of that, my method of reading poetry is very arguably surface level, and maybe superficial, you could say, arguably, but it's a lot more akin to how I listen to music. When I'm listening to music, I don't know music theory, I'm not a musician, so when I'm listening to music, I'm looking for melodies that strike me, music that grips me, powerful moments in music. I'm not one to, geek out over, key changes or chord progressions or things like this. I don't have the knowledge for that, in the same way that I don't have the knowledge for poetry. And so when I read a poem, what I'm looking for is really just, I will read a poem and say, okay, which verses in this strike me? And that can pertain to a number of different things. It can be that sonically it's very beautiful, it's sort of musically written. It can be that there's an image that I find very beautiful. There can be an insight that I get, or a piece of wisdom that I get from some verses. Or at least I feel like there's a piece of wisdom in verses. I don't always know what the piece of wisdom is, but I sort of detect that there's something profound going on in a poem, and if I detect that in a couple of verses, I will underline them. And so on and so forth. I just underline verses that strike me for some reason, even though I can't always explain why I find them striking. And then what I do after I read that poem is I turn the page, set the book aside, and usually, sort of forget about the poem for a while. I might reread it the next day, I might reread it next week, I might reread it the next month, or a year later. But basically, I just mark the poem off by dog-earing the page on the bottom of the page. I know for some of you, dog-earing is like murdering your children, but I use it liberally. And then I will ideally come back to it at some point, and usually when I come back to it, it has sort of percolated in my subconscious, and insights emerge, and that also occasionally happens with poems that I don't love the first time. Sometimes I read a poem, don't really get it, don't really underline anything, don't really get any of the verses, and then just move on with my life. But then accidentally, or maybe because someone recommended the poem to me or something, I return to it and something comes out, and then I start to like it a lot more. But anyway, that's how I read poetry. I read it for a sort of surface level, visceral reaction to these verses, and without necessarily being able to explain why I react to them. And so, because my relationship with poems is so based on a sort of long-term involvement with them, and because even when I have that long-term involvement, I have a hard time articulating why I go back to a poem, it's hard for me to, intelligently explain to you why I think you should read this book, It would be hard for me to, pick out a poem, and say, here's what Sylvia Plath is doing that's so brilliant here. The only thing I could do is just read you some verses, and I do want to read you some verses from one of the last poems in this book, in this volume, and the poem is called Fever 103. and I'll just read them to you. And these are some verses that I underlined, so I'll only read. I won't read the whole poem. I'll just read the verses that I underlined. And so the poem starts like this: Pure, what does it mean? The tongues of hell are dull, dull as the triple tongues of dull, fat Cerberus who wheezes at the gate. Incapable of licking clean the augie tendon, the sin, the tinder cries, the indelible smell of a snuffed candle. Love, love, the low smokes roll from me like Isadora's scarves. I'm in a fright. One scarf will catch an anchor in the wheel. And I just found those opening stanzas incredibly powerful on a sonic level. I don't get what she's saying exactly in that, but I think that the language is so beautiful that it sort of speaks for itself. And I underlined those, and I will come back to them at some point, and maybe I will get some insight into what they mean. But anyway, so I can't dissect those lines and tell you why I think they're great. I just think that they sound great when you read them aloud. And that's one of the things that I think does recommend this volume, is that I think these poems are great for reading aloud. They feel like oral poems, and there are actually a lot of video audio recordings of Sylvia Plath reading a lot of the poems from this collection on YouTube, and I will link some of them, and I recommend you go listen to them, because she does a great job reading them, and she'll do a much better job than I will. And yeah, so I recommend those. These are also poems that are really memorizable. They're just so memorable, and I think because Sylvia Plath has such an ear for musicality in the language, that they're very easy to memorize. I actually, for a long time, had Lady Lazarus and Daddy, 2 poems in here, memorized, and I still have large chunks of them memorized. I could probably recite most of both of them to you, but I won't do that. And they're very, very lyrical, very memorizable, and I think with Sylvia Plath, there's just this brutal honesty that everyone who's read her has found incredibly attractive, and yeah, so I definitely recommend this collection, even though I can't exactly articulate very well why I think the poems are so good, but anyway, so I think this will be a short video, but yeah, anyway, I just want to talk about Ariel because Sylvia Plath is one of my favorite poets, and it's kind of weird that I haven't talked about her more on my channel, but now I'm talking about her. I'm making a whole video about her collection, so anyway, yeah, I recommend it. I think it's very accessible. You know, I think Sylvia Plath is a great writer to start with if you want to get into poetry. So anyway, yeah, that's Ariel. Let me know if you've read this book or read any of Sylvia Plath's other work and want to give me your input in the comments, or if you have any other comments on anything else I've said, then let me know. And yeah, we can have a conversation. So I'll let you all go, and thank you for watching. I'll talk to you later. Bye.